Why do American ghettos persist? Scholars and commentators often identify some factors, such as single motherhood, joblessness, or violent street crime, as the key to solving the problem and recommend policies accordingly. But Tommie Shelby argues these attempts to fix ghettos or help their poor inhabitants ignore fundamental questions of justice and fail to see the urban poor as moral agents responding to injustice. In this excerpt, the author argues that policy efforts to abolish the ghetto must abandon this medical model approach to social reform, and instead aim to empower and respect the ghetto poor. Dark Ghettos, Injustice, Dissent, and Reform by Tommie Shelby. The ghetto should be abolished. Like American slavery and Jim Crow segregation, the ghetto should never have come into existence. In calling for its abolition, I'm not suggesting that Black neighborhoods should be proscribed or that their poor Black inhabitants should be dispersed. There's nothing wrong with the existence of predominantly Black urban communities, and in light of the long-standing predicament of Black people in the United States, there's much to be said in favor of such neighborhoods. The problem is that too many Black neighborhoods lack needed resources, are offered only inadequate public services and substandard schools, are beset with violent stream crime, and are home to many stigmatized and unjustly disadvantaged people with little spatial or economic mobility. Abolishing the ghetto should not be seen simply as a matter of overcoming racial prejudice or reviving the war on poverty. It should instead be viewed as an aggressive attempt at fundamental reform of the basic structure of our society. We, as residents of the United States, are all implicated in the perpetuation of ghettos. The ghetto is not their problem, but ours, privileged and disadvantaged alike. The ghetto is a sign that our social order is profoundly unjust. It is a sign obscured by a host of legitimating ideologies, racist, sexist, economic, moral, religious, and nationalist. Insofar as we uphold that order, we are complicit in the oppression of our fellow citizens and, for some at least, contributing to our own oppression. Our duty of justice calls for response. In recent reform efforts, disadvantaged ghetto denizens are too often viewed more as unruly chess pieces than as moral agents and allies. Yet the myriad ways in which they register dissent, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, suggest that many act defiantly out of a sense of justice. Their non-compliance with societal expectations, refusing to delay childbearing, to marry, to accept low-paying and demeaning jobs, to respect the law, and to submit to other mainstream norms, can be a healthy expression of self-respect and a morally rooted opposition to the status quo, not mere nihilism or despair. Even some of their defiant acts of transgression may add to their burdens and annoy, anger, and frighten the affluent. They are not unjustified and certainly don't warrant condemnation. Instead, this rebellion should draw our attention to the failures of reciprocity embedded in the social institutions and informal practices that constitute the structure of our society. Of course, not everything the ghetto poor do and say merits approbation, and some of their conduct is, frankly, harmful wrongdoing and should therefore be discouraged and sometimes punished. But there is much to be learned from the impure dissent that emanates from American ghettos, whether this dissent takes the form of hip-hop expression or more implicit modes of communication. These valuable elements should be seen as part of a political ethic that we might label ghetto abolitionism. Calls for the abolition of ghettos date back to the Civil Rights Movement. The movement to end Jim Crow was based primarily in the South, where Blacks were not fully urbanized, explicit segregation laws were enforced, and Blacks lacked an effective right to vote or run for public office. It took years of organized protest, skillful political maneuvering, and the Civil Rights Act the Voting Rights Act to abolish the Jim Crow regime, though its negative effects are still felt today. Meanwhile, in cities like Los Angeles, New York City, Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, Newark, and Baltimore, blacks had been locked in the ghetto for decades, despite the absence of explicit segregation laws, and notwithstanding the freedom to participate in electoral politics. It was in these cities and others that early calls for the abolition of the ghetto rang out, in the fiery speeches of black militants, in the verse essays, plays, and books by intellectuals and artists, in the boycott and union organizing of working-class people, and in destructive urban riots. These campaigns for social justice highlighted the plight of the oppressed and poor black urban communities and demanded not only civil rights and an end to institutional racism, but also economic justice and a fair criminal justice system. Consider the Black Panthers Party's 10-point program. It called for the political empowerment of black communities, a full employment economy, and guaranteed income for the involuntary jobless, reparations for years of labor exploitation, decent and affordable housing, quality education for all, universal health care, and fundamental criminal justice reform. The group recruited in ghettos, capturing the attention and raising the consciousness of poor black youth. Indeed, Huey Newton, co-founder of the party, argued that the lumpen proletariat, the unemployable element of the working class with no assets or marketable skills, who therefore often turn to the underground economy for income, had revolutionary potential. Whatever one think of the ideology, tactics, or leadership of the Black Panthers, it cannot be denied that they mobilized to abolish ghettos on grounds of systemic injustice. Ghetto abolitionism, for these black radicals, was a collective effort, one that included the ghetto poor as allies, to, in my terms, fundamentally change the basic structure of the U.S. society. After the demise of the Black Power movement, the emergence of a relatively large black middle class, most of whom no longer live in ghetto neighborhoods, and the substantial increase of black elected officials, including many mayors of large U.S. cities, demands for the abolition of the ghetto have been less insistent and more muted. The call must be renewed. Perhaps that's what we're seeing in the recent Black Lives Matter movement to end unjustified police violence and racial profiling, and in the youth-led uprisings in Ferguson and Baltimore. These welcome developments echo the 50-year-old Black Panther Party demand for an immediate end to police brutality and murder of black people. Such defiant protest is an essential element of ghetto abolitionism, though it must move beyond a focus on racism and the police to a broader campaign focused on economic justice. I join the call for ghetto abolitionism, and this book, which is insufficient as a solution to all of the complex problems of the ghetto, is meant as an answer to the call. It is a contribution to the intellectual arm of a collective effort that reaches back at least to Du Bois, the Philadelphia Negro. I offer no new political strategies or policy proposals. Others are better equipped for those tasks. What I have offered is a defense of a set of values and principles that should inform the next ghetto abolition movement, a non-ideal theory of corrective justice with its accompanying political ethics. I've offered a way of conceptualizing the problem as one of basic justice rather than black poverty. And I've defended a philosophical framework for responding to the problem, a systemic injustice model rather than the medical model that now reigns in policy circles and among black elites. Let me close by briefly commenting on each of these ideas. Ghetto abolitionism, when viewed within the systemic injustice framework and in accordance with liberal egalitarian principles, would aid more than just the ghetto poor. It would help all who are unjustly disadvantaged. It not only attacks racism in all its forms, but calls for more robust enforcement of anti-discrimination law. It opposes class-based stratification, demanding a more equitable sharing of the benefits of social cooperation, technological advance, and economic growth. It insists on equal and extensive liberty for all, from freedom of expression and association to the right to an unconditional social minimum and to participate as equals in collective self-governance. Ghetto abolitionism must be a grassroots effort, at least initially. It aims to change minds, to extend the bonds of solidarity, to mobilize and organize, and ultimately to influence public policy, from local ordinances to federal law. Liberal egalitarian policy, when in corrective justice mode, is not limited to anti-poverty initiatives, but seeks more comprehensive social reform. When it embraces ghetto abolitionism, as it should, such policy eschews the medical model of social problem solving and fully embraces the systemic injustice paradigm. Fundamental questions about the basic structure of society are not avoided, and considerations of civic reciprocity are kept clearly and constantly in view. Given the duty to ease the burdens of the oppressed, policy efforts must lighten the load on the ghetto poor while we work diligently to bring about a fully just society. These efforts must respect the moral and political agency of ghetto denizens, however. This means, for instance, not treating residential integration as a policy goal. The ghetto poor should be economically empowered and protected from housing discrimination so that they have real freedom to choose their neighborhood communities. Reproductive freedom should be respected, and while some wrongful procreation among the ghetto poor may exist, a stingy welfare regime should not be used to deter it, as this would only compound the economic injustices faced by many Black women. No doubt poor families would be better off if they had two adult co-parents to share the workload, but the public lacks legitimate tools to do any more than recommend this familial arrangement. As there is nothing wrong with single mother families, provided they receive the public support they are due, the state isn't justified in maintaining a highly punitive child support regime on the basis of paternity alone. Nor is the state a suitable matchmaker for the oppressed, and many who share a biological child would do better for themselves and their children by not sharing a household. Policymakers should certainly expand employment opportunities for the jobless, but the employment options and wages for low-skilled workers would need to be significantly improved and workfare requirements dropped altogether if the state is to avoid punishing the Black poor into exploitative and demeaning forms of servitude. While voluntary job training and skills enhancement programs are welcome, a state that has created and allowed the ghetto to persist lacks the moral standing to act as an aggressive agent of cultural reform in the lives of its most embattled citizens. In the view of the serious injustices that disfigure the basic structure of society, sinking it below any reasonable standard of tolerable injustice, the ghetto poor owe neither loyalty nor obedience to the state. Even the state's enforcement rights are in jeopardy in light of racialized mass incarceration and unnecessary and often malicious violence in law enforcement practice. Criminal justice reform has to be a priority. Due process is a constitutional essential that underwrites the state's moral right to punish criminal offenders, and some who commit violent acts in ghettos must be contained to protect the weak and vulnerable in those communities. As my title indicates, this book is partly inspired by and a tribute to Kenneth B. Clark's important but neglected work, Dark Ghetto: Dilemmas of Social Power. Clark is best known for his role in convincing the U.S. Supreme Court that school segregation negatively affects Black youth, which led to separate but equal public policy being declared unconstitutional. He also conducted the Note series of televised interviews, The Negro and the American Promise, which featured Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin. The interviews were later transcribed and collected in the book The Negro Protest, wherein Clark, reflecting on the political ethics of Blacks in America, concludes, "The Negro has no more or less virtues or frailties than those found in other human beings. He is an individual who varies as much in courage and cowardice or ambivalence as do other human beings. He reacts to injustices and cruelties with the same patterns of accommodation, intimidation, rebellion, or philosophy as do others." Although Clark's Dark Ghetto is rooted in psychology and my book is a work of philosophy, I'm entering the long overdue conversation his book initiated, but that was never fully taken up. The post-civil rights scholarly and public discussion of ghetto communities was shaped more by another work, made public the same year, Daniel Patrick Moynihan's The Negro Family: The Case for National Action. I prefer Clark's treatise not because Moynihan uses the inflammatory word pathology to describe features of Black life in ghetto communities. Clark uses the word even more frequently and to refer to precisely the same phenomena: welfare dependency, single mother families, non marital births, broken homes, disorder, delinquency, addiction, violence, and crime. I don't prefer dark ghetto because Moynihan blames the victim, and Clark does not. Clark is actually much more critical of the conduct of ghetto denizens. I don't side with Clark because he is Black and Moynihan white, or because Clark spent many years living in a ghetto and Moynihan did not. No doubt Clark's racial identity and past residence in a ghetto community give him greater standing among Blacks and whites alike. To be bold when assessing the actions and attitudes of the ghetto poor, a privilege that, arguably, I'm exercising myself. But my claims rest on no presumption of epistemic privilege by virtue of my race or class background. Finally, my fondness for Clark over Moynihan is not because one is a liberal and the other a radical, as both were avowed liberals. Rather, I'm drawn to Clark's study because it seems to me to better exhibit the systemic injustice model than Moynihan's infamous but influential report. I do not endorse all of Clark's particular theoretical conclusions. I don't agree that dependence on public support is pathological or an unfair burden on the public, for instance. Nor do I think reliance on public support is a threat to personal dignity. I do not accept his patriarchal conception of the family or of male gender identity, and I'm not inclined to see integration as a solution to Black disadvantage. Yet, I believe that Clark's book falls into fewer pits than Moynihan's report, rooted as Moynihan's was in the medical model approach to social problems. Moynihan does insist that U.S. society has not provided substantive equal opportunity for all Blacks and should seek racial parity in socioeconomic well-being. But he conceptualizes the problem of the ghetto as primarily one of family instability, which he claims perpetuates the cycle of poverty and is associated dysfunctional conduct. He takes the linchpin of this problem to be high rates of male unemployment, which calls for an anti-poverty strategy of enhancing job opportunities and increasing labor force participation. While he acknowledges the significance of past racial injustice in creating unstable Black families, he says, at this point, the present tangle of pathology is capable of perpetuating itself without assistance from the white world. Drawing attention to his implicit reliance on the medical model of reform isn't to indict Moynihan. After all, as Assistant Secretary of Labor at the time, he was attempting to persuade the Johnson administration to take proactive measures to address racial inequality. He wasn't addressing the general public or trying to spur or support a social movement for wide-ranging egalitarian reform. Nevertheless, the differences between his approach and Clark's are striking and important. Clark consistently structures his explanatory claims around questions of social justice. He does not avoid making judgments of value or tackling controversial moral questions. He insists that objectivity in social inquiry is not equivalent to value neutrality, and he speaks freely about empirical facts and social justice without attempting to reduce matters of value to matters of fact, without treating values as merely subjective, and without regarding disagreements about justice as intractable or irresolvable. He recognizes, and this is key, that the only way forward is to give both scientific research and ethical reflection their due. Grasping the importance of listening to the voices of the ghetto poor, Clark's prologue, titled "The Cry of the Ghetto," consists of 32 quotes from ghetto denizens, male and female of all ages, who reflect on their plight and register their strong dissent from the status quo, condemning racism and discrimination, economic inequality and exploitation, lack of access to decent education, police brutality and harassment, inadequate protection from violence, political marginalization, media representations of Black life, and American imperialism. In Clark's text, the ghetto poor are treated as agents of social change, as playing a central role in rebuilding their communities, and as taking the lead in reform efforts. However, Clark does not romanticize the ghetto poor. He suggests, for example, that the ghetto outlaw persona is often mere pretense. He claims that self-esteem is sometimes acquired perversely through violent conduct. He notes the rampant political cynicism in ghetto communities. He believes that some ostensible dissent is nothing more than catharsis and posturing. Clark highlights the challenge of maintaining self-esteem and self-respect under ghetto conditions, and the challenge of maintaining Black solidarity in the face of internal class division. Yet he holds that the preservation of self-respect despite pervasive injustice is a prerequisite for any successful campaign for justice. In some acts of delinquency, he sees rebellion against oppression. For instance, he argues that dropping out of school is sometimes a defiant affirmation of self-respect in response to the condescension, low expectations, and racism of teachers, and he believes it would be productive to enlist delinquents and criminal offenders in the collective project of solving community problems. Clark regards unemployment and underemployment as problems, but he emphasizes the fact that poor Blacks are often restricted to menial service jobs that pay poverty-level wages. Joblessness, as such, is not therefore the linchpin. It is the quality of the jobs available and the low wage that call out for remedy. To prevent urban riots, Clark suggests creating decent jobs and reducing socioeconomic inequality. This would require fundamental change, a dramatic movement toward a more just society, rather than mere work programs and social services for the poor. Indeed, Clark appreciates how the single-minded focus on helping disadvantaged Blacks obscures and evades the fact that the ghetto poor are in need because they live under a social structure that is unjust and that has shaped their personalities, conduct, and ambitions. This benefactor stance also conceals the fact that there are people with a vested interest in leaving the basic structure more or less as it is. Social work and philanthropy are inadequate and insulting responses to the problems of the ghetto, because they are rooted in benevolence rather than justice and opt to leave Black communities dependent upon the goodwill of others rather than empowering them. Clark invokes with approval the internal colonization thesis, the Black power claim that the white power structure functions as a mother country over its Black ghetto colonies. This analogy is not perfect, but it has the virtue of making vivid social relationships of domination and exploitation. Clark also focuses on the privileges of affluent whites, their tendency to rationalize their complicity in injustice, and their role in perpetuating ghetto conditions. And he even notes how some Black leaders in the ghetto, clergy, informal spokespersons, and elective representatives exploit the status quo for personal gain. Finally, one of the things that Clark appreciates is that the modern American ghetto is not only appropriate for social scientific study, but also ripe for philosophical reflection. To understand Harlem, one must seek the truth, and one must dare to accept and understand the truths one does find. One must understand its inconsistencies, its contradictions, its paradoxes, its ironies, its comic and its tragic face, its cruel and its self-destructive forces, and its desperate surge for life. And above all, one must understand its humanity. The truth of the dark ghetto is not merely a truth about Negroes. It reflects the deeper torment and anguish of the total human predicament. My book is political in the way some academic books are and political philosophy must be. While it is not a social scientific study, it is informed, indeed deeply shaped by such studies, and offers an interpretation of their moral significance. But this book is also a philosophical meditation on the life in America's ghettos. I was searching and continue to search for those deeper, elusive, and more general truths behind the familiar facts about poor Black neighborhoods. I hope my empathy for the plight of disadvantaged ghetto denizens is evident. But though moved by a sense of identification and solidarity with them, I have tried to remain objective and self-critical throughout. A philosophical treatise on the ghetto might seem foolhardy, arrogant, and quixotic. The issues are tremendously complex. The topic is so big that no lone individual can be expected to say anything about it that is at once true, significant, and comprehensive. The relevant empirical and philosophical literature is vast, more than one can master in a lifetime of study, and the subject is highly controversial, where emotions run hot and enemies and strange bedfellows are easily made. So it might seem wiser or safer for a philosopher to dip his or her toe in these dark waters rather than dive right in. Yet here I am, soaked from head to foot. Though I have been developing its arguments for more than 10 years, this book is not, as Kenneth Clark claimed, his Dark Ghetto, to be a study of the total phenomena of the ghetto. There are relevant issues concerning education, democracy, and health, for example, that I have not addressed. I feel compelled, however, to make my current thinking public, trusting that readers will understand that all interdisciplinary work, particularly across the humanities social science divide, has limitations of scope and depth. My hope is that other scholars, seeing merit in my approach, will be moved to supplement, build on, and correct these initial efforts. I don't expect mine to be the last word.